Hello, my name is Jordan Poss. I'm a historian and author. I'm the author of a couple of novels as well as a novella called The Last Day of Marcus Tullius Cicero, which I'm going to read from for this video. I'm going to read the first two sections. It doesn't exactly have chapters, but the entire story takes place on the day Cicero is tracked down and assassinated. It's all right there on the cover. December 7th, 43 BC. We had sailed through the night from Antium, and Marcus Tullius came on deck at daybreak as we neared Caieta. One would not have known he was on the run. He was a magnificent man even in old age, even as his body failed him. His oratorical postures are well known. Even his silences are famous to this day. Left elbow cocked on the arm of a chair, the chin at rest in an upturned palm, and the lips and great crest of nose turned in damning boredom upon the subject of his gaze. Such he could still do, as well as strut and gesture and slice the air with one hand freed of his toga. But other things had begun to fail. Though he would not, in his vanity, let on, his eyes were not as sharp as in the past. One hip troubled him, depending on the weather, and he relied upon our sedan chair rather more often than he had used to. The middle finger of his right hand had begun to seize, to lock in place. He would pop it back into motion with great effort and an alarming crack, and after a time of riding or of holding some utensil it would have seized again into place, now as a talon hooked around the stylus. Small things, but things we slaves did not miss, even if the old man could deceive the Senate and the people. And that morning he did look old. He had not washed or shaved for a few days, since turning back on the road to Rome. One would have thought he was in mourning. His face was drawn and pale, and his hair unkempt and longer than was his wont. He had risen from a camp bed below and looked like an old centurion, past due for retirement but refusing to leave his legion even as senescence overtook him. He stood and watched the sailors furl the sail as we approached the headland and sunlight first touched the heights. He saw me after a moment and greeted me. "Good morning, Leonidas." "And to you, master." He hobbled across the deck. I learnt later that he had never gotten his sea legs, and the old Romans loved him for it, and stretched. "Not far now." "No, sir." I took a closer look at him. "Are you well?" He nodded rather too vigorously. "Quite," he said, and after a moment, "Seasickness." "Yes, sir." We had had a rough night sailing from Antium. A December storm blew in and had threatened to dash us on the coast. "I asked the captain to put in near Caieta. I can go no farther like this. We will stay a while at the villa there before moving on." I doubted the wisdom of halting, again, while Marcus Antonius's henchmen were a threat, but nodded and pointed forward to the left, to the headland sheltering the entrance to the bay of Formii. He looked. Golden morning light crept down a high temple. The wooded shore soft in the breeze, tossing not unlike the sea itself in the dawn's last gloaming. "Ah," he said after a time. His eyes, you remember. "Apollo's temple. Donated something to it myself a while back, you know." "Yes, master," I said. We all knew. He looked up at the morning sky, a sweep of pearl, gold, and every shade of azure. "Appropriate sight first thing in the morning, is it not?" "Sir?" He gestured, and I marked the finger crooked down into the palm as he pointed to the temple. "The first rays of the sun blessing a shrine to Apollo." "Ah," I said in my turn. He shrugged. "Divine coincidence everywhere, I suppose. You will ask for news of Quintus when we have arrived?" "Yes, sir." My master had parted ways with his brother some days before, Quintus, poor, despairing Quintus, having decided to hang back. He had taken nothing when he had fled his home, and so had nothing with which to sustain his flight. The brothers would seek their fortunes separately. One prayed, as we all did, that Quintus Tullius Cicero might be spared. It was Marcus Tullius Cicero that Marcus Antonius wanted dead. He nodded and took his right hand in his left, and then gave me a shifty glance. I pretended not to notice, and with a cruel jerk he snapped his finger straight out again. He shook the hand a few times, as if fanning himself. "Unseasonably warm," he said. I suppressed a laugh. "Yes, sir," I said. It was for a December morning on the sea. The sailors had run out the oars and rowed now, bringing us around the headland and into the harbor, heading for shore. Others came on deck. A handful of slaves, my master's freedman secretary, Tiro, in his cap, a bodyguard in an army cloak. I had spoken to him a few times. He was called Gnaeus Mucus, but came from a small and unstoried side of that clan. He had spent 19 years in the army and served in every capacity available. He had been a senior centurion with Pompeius the Great at his defeat in Greece and come home with Julius Caesar's pardon, like Brutus and Cassius. He had hoped for retirement to a country farm and a bosomy Samnite girl, but no sooner had Caesar been murdered, he saw new threats to the Republic and offered his services to my master, who quietly accepted. "Good morning, Senator," Gnaeus said as he stepped on deck. He walked crabwise to the gunwale and leaned against it. Another old Roman meant to walk terra firma, not sail the seas like a Greek. He nodded to me, said, "Greekling," and grinned. This was our joke. I am not Greek, but Thracian by blood. I received the name Leonidas as a young slave in another household. "A good morning, recruit." This was my joke. "It is, and the same to you." As we rounded the spit of rock guarding Cayeta from the sea, Tiro came alongside us and nodded to the temple, yawing ever nearer above the waves. "A beautiful sight to redeem a night spent retching overboard," he said. Tiro, like our master, had a way with words. You will have read his finer accounts of what I will relate. "A temple to Apollo," I said. "Yes, I've been to this estate before." "Your expertise, as always, is appreciated," Gnaeus said. "I have been to this estate too, you know." Tiro gave me a look. We had known each other for years. I knew he did not appreciate tweaking, and he knew why I was anxious to land and reach the villa. Tiro itched under his freedman's cap and began to speak, but was interrupted. A sharp noise came to us from the direction of the shore, like scornful, nasal laughter. We turned and looked again. There seemed to be smoke coming from the temple. It rose in wisps that rapidly twisted and curled back on themselves. There was something uncanny about the movement of this smoke. "That's some wind," one of the sailors said. "Morning sacrifice," my master said. "Not their usual schedule," Tiro said. "And what is that damned noise?" Gnaeus said. We stared, each of us attempting to unriddle the nature of this smoke. I saw my master put the ball of his fist into his hip and hoist himself forward, squinting toward the temple. Perhaps his sight had not deteriorated to the point I had thought, because I believe to this day that I heard him say, "Crows?" Suddenly the smoke dissolved and whipped downward from the temple to the sea, and a flight of great black crows overtook our ship and whirled about us, cawing and batting their wings at us like the harpies. One of the sailors screamed and ducked into the cover of the sail. The rest of us crouched and covered our heads. All except my master. He stood in his old way, unstooped, head raised, hands poised to strike at the audience, but with a look of uttermost resignation upon his face. At last the crows checked their flight and landed in great numbers all over the ship. The yard arm and gunwales were lined with them, and they busily cawed at us, cocked their sharp black eyes at us, and pecked and nibbled the ropes. "Shoo, you," Gnaeus said, and swatted at them with his centurion staff. "Get on, damn you!" The sailor beneath the sail point peeked out, trembling, and ducked back under the sailcloth when he saw. My master approached him. "What troubles you?" The sailor presented only a trembling hand and pointed. "These crows, sir." The captain of the ship, an old Neapolitan, bearded like Neptune himself, called from the rear of the ship, "A bad omen, Senator." He need not have explained. We were all familiar with the augure's art, divining the flight of birds. I turned to look at my master. This was his moment. He loved to dispense wisdom, to dredge up some ancient saying or thought of his own that would bring light to a dark time. We slaves sometimes received these wisdoms too often. He once held forth to me for an hour on old Cato's advice regarding farming, with his own glosses, while I redug a drainage ditch in his garden on a hot day. But we did not despise him for it. When his wisdom came at the right time, it was exactly the right time. I awaited his speech, some surprising moral to be drawn from the moment, but none came. It shocked me as much as his calm in the middle of the crows did, but Marcus Tullius Cicero nodded, bit his lip as if in thought, and said nothing more until we came to shore. We hove to in a quiet cove between Cayeta and Formiae and set about preparing to carry the household to Marcus Tullius's villa inland between the two towns. The sailors dragged the ship prow first onto the beach until it was stable, and then assisted the household slaves and freedmen in unloading my master's cargo. There was no great deal, just enough to delay us on the strand for an hour or so. In addition to the letters, books, notes, wax tablets, and surplus writing materials, all in watertight cases of Tiro's design, we had the sedan chair and an assortment of carrying poles depending on the manpower available for lifting it. A lot of food and provisions and 2 amphorae of imported wine my master could not leave his estate in Tusculum without. This may sound like luxury, but for a man of a long and prestigious career, widely published and a great authority, Marcus Tullius traveled light into exile. After all, he had done it before. As we unloaded and then arranged the goods for travel to the villa, he stood on the shore carrying the one item he would not leave to the slaves to move, a small painted figurine out of the household shrine in Tusculum, a figurine of Tullia. Gnaeus fell to and directed our work. A centurion never really retires. Throughout, he never strayed more than a few steps from my master. Tiro moved to and fro, accounting for the handful of goods and making certain the sailors did not break or steal anything. I liked Tiro. He was fussy and wore his learning on his sleeve. What poor boy made good does not. But he was kind and had not fallen into the trap awaiting most former slaves, of cruelty to those yet in servitude. But most importantly, he was faithful. He had returned from the farm for which he had toiled and scrimped as a freedman to help our master in his time of need. The sailors and some of the slaves murmured darkly about the crows as we worked. We had all seen bird sign 1,000 times before. My master would have seen the skies red for flight, sometimes multiple times, before every meeting of the Senate. But here there was dispute about what the omen meant. I wearied of the talk. In the absence of a trained augur, everyone is an expert. I worked as quickly as I could, ignoring the murmurs, so that we could pack up and head to the villa. I wanted to see Clementia. Clementia. It was not her real name, which was some unpronounceable German noise, but it suited her well. We had met some years ago during a summer retreat to the coast, where the sea breezes and the height above the shore kept the villa cool. She was a young thing, newly purchased in Mediolanum, and I not much older. I was under Cicero's tutelage at the time, preparing to be one of his potential replacements upon his manumission, and the mistress put Clementia to work in the gardens during the day and putting the final touches on dinner in the evenings. We fell for each other, and ended the weeks of that summer fumbling about with each other as often as possible in the concealment of a shaded lane nearby, invisible from the house above. Every summer since had been the same. I looked at Cicero scraping notes into a wax tablet on the shore, at my master's side. Those years ago, when I met Clementia, the possibility seemed so remote as not to warrant thought, but now I hoped. I prayed for manumission, for my master to make me a free man. I had saved what I could. The first thing I would do is redeem Clementia, marry her, and use what little we had left to settle on a farm in the hills. Cicero had done it through faithful service. I had spent the 11 years in the household trying to do the same. But for now, there was the reunion with Clementia. At last the sun was well up over the hills and shining down on the shore, and the naked sailors pulled on their tunics and headed to town for wine and whoring. Cicero took a final look at the goods and nodded. He turned to Marcus Tullius. My master did not immediately react. I looked closely. He was lost in thought, uncharacteristically so. Cicero cleared his throat, and my master looked up. "All is ashore and ready," he said. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Marcus Cicero. I am ready myself, and as heavy a load as anything else on this beach." We laughed, and the 8 of us bore him up in the sedan chair for the walk to the villa. Even with the extra numbers, the walk was hard. We went mostly uphill in the rugged coastal terrain, avoiding the main roads and taking smaller, broken tracks to avoid detection. And with his joint aches, my master had put on weight in the last year or two, and he had never been lean, like the late Julius Caesar, or outright scrawny, like the late lamented Cato. I had volunteered to help lift, though technically that was beneath my station, and had the pole at his right, immediately behind the chair. I tried to get a glimpse of him. His color looked better now that he was ashore, but there was still something corpse-like about him. I suppose that had become normal. He had never been quite the same since Tullius died. It was well past the 3rd hour of the day by the time we caught sight of the villa, reared above the path on a rocky outcropping. This villa was unique among my master's holdings in 2 particulars. It was smaller than had become usual among the senatorial class in Rome, and it was older than any other house my master owned. When my master's old enemy Clodius Pulcher, an impious demagogue my master had once testified against on a charge of incest, had forced him into exile, he had had the state confiscate and burn every house his men could get hold of. Claudius had even erected a temple on the ruins of my master's house in Rome to further complicate his efforts to get his property back should he ever return. The only house Claudius's men had not gotten to was this one, set in the rough, secluded hill country about a mile from the sea. The house represented, as few things could, a time before the last 10 years of trouble. With it in sight, my heart and my step quickened. A few times the men ahead of me grunted a curse, told me to slow down and keep pace. Now, Leonidas, the girl is still there," Marcus Tullius said. I flushed. "Of course, sir." I sensed rather than saw him smile. "Self-control will get you what you want, and allow you to keep it, too." I felt heartened. I ached to think back on it. "Yes, sir." I felt him sit up, and he called out, "Quicken the pace, lads, we are all weary." We made the hill and were setting the chair down at the door of the house in minutes. I fought to keep my composure as we waited. Cicero opened the door, and Marcus Tullius, with Gnaeus just ahead of him, stepped into the house. I wiped my brow and nodded to the other panting bearers and followed. In the entryway, my master placed the figurine of Tullia on the shelf above the household altar. He then went servant by servant, greeting them. He moved slowly and concealed it by lingering over his greetings, but I marked the way he rubbed his hip under the folds of his toga. Gnaeus hung back by the altar, eyeing the line of slaves. He had both hands under his cloak, ready to defend my master if necessary. I had seen the look in his eye and that dangerous posture many times before in Caesar, but here the aggression was directed toward protecting an old man, not bringing down an old republic. I searched the room for Clementia. At last I saw her, down at the end of the line beyond our master, obscured from sight by his hunched bulk. She caught my eye and suppressed a grin. I could see it in the way she pursed her lips, and the tip of her nose dipped inward with the strain. "Ah, Clementia," my master said, shifting ungracefully to her. "Dear Clementia, how is your Latin?" She said something demurely low, but I caught a sharp sound or two, verbal relics of her childhood beyond the Rhine. Her eyes ticked from him to me and back. "I look forward to some of that fish sauce you have perfected," he was saying. "You have surpassed them all, dear Clementia. Now," he said with a clap of his hands. He struck one of his rostrum-appropriate poses and said to the assembled household, "To your work. Waste no more time on account of an old senator." The servants scattered. My master, with 3 or 4 others, headed into the house toward the inner courtyard and its garden. I started for Clementia, but she gave me a look that stopped me. "Clementia?" She did not move from her place, but jerked her head after our master. "Go to him." "Go." She looked divine, if it is not sacrilege to say so. The poets do. Her hair was still white blonde, her eyes the unnatural blue of those marshland barbarians. She had filled out since last I saw her, and looked the better for it. My confusion vied with my eyes, which searched the folds of her clothing for her shape. She noticed and looked away. Finally, she raised a hand and motioned again after Marcus Tullius. "Later. Now go." I nodded, watched her go, and then followed my master deeper into the house. I caught up in the courtyard. My master lowered himself with a hint of difficulty to the low wall around the garden. Cneius stepped forward to assist, but hesitated and hung back. Tiro stood busy with his wax tablet beside 3 others. Spintharus, formerly one of Tiro's replacements as secretary, but now freeman butler of this house, the captain of the ship, and a wizened old man in a senatorial toga whom I did not recognize. I stepped up as the old man greeted my master in the elaborate but out-of-date fashion of the ancient clients, solicitous but not giddy, deferential without servility, anxious to please without toadying, a way that seemed to honor both men at the same time. My master glanced at me and bade the old man pause with a gesture. "Ah, Leonidas, give your ship over to the winds, but never your soul to a woman, Leonidas." I could not help but laugh. "That's good, sir. Yours?" "My brother's, speaking from experience." "Your brother was not so fortunate as you were, sir." Tiro glanced at me. Our master's 2 marriages were a touchy subject, especially the second, not long dissolved. Our fortunes were similar, but no, he did not bear it as he ought. I was relieved, until he sat up with a jerk and looked me in the eye. "Any news of Quintus?" I had forgotten. "I will inquire, sir. I apologize." He waved me off. "No need for that. We have yet time." I nodded and caught a glimpse of Clementia bustling past an open door across the courtyard. In elder days the garden had been one of her responsibilities. It looked as though she still kept it up. This being December, little grew and nothing bloomed, but its cultivation was lovely, and our master enjoyed greeting visitors here or reading when the light in his library failed. I watched her go as he turned again to the old senator. "No need as well for the elaborate greeting, Germanicus. My friends, you know or surely know of Caius Quinctilius Fawkes Germanicus, late of the Senate, one-time censor, and now enjoying retirement in the waters of Formiae?" We greeted him as was appropriate to our differing stations. I recognized the name. He had won some relatively minor engagement against Clementia's people and thus earned his honorific, but that had been long ago. I looked more closely as Marcus Tullius introduced us. The man was not merely wizened, but withered, a husk, wrinkled like the sand at low tide from hairless head to crooked toe. The dignity and glory of his feats were long ago, well before this time of trouble. "Germanicus has brought news from Rome." Gossip more like," Germanicus said, "but it comes from persons I trust." "Yes?" "Marcus Antonius is another Sulla. He has taken the proscriptions in earnest, and Caesar, or that boy called Caesar, is reconciled to his partner's murders." Sulla's proscriptions, his hit list of enemies, was a nightmare memory of the older men of the Republic. The late Caesar had lived through it as a youth. The late Pompeius had gotten his start in the butchery. My master listened grimly. "Go on." "You know the tribune Salvius?" "Yes." "When he heard for certain that his name was on the lists that Caesar, Antonius, and Lepidus had agreed upon, he gave a feast to bid his friends farewell before going into exile. One of Antonius's men caught up to him during the feast, and with the tables laden and all of Salvius's guests reclining, hauled Salvius down over the table by the hair and hacked his head off. Carried it right out and left everyone reclining at a bloody table, his corpse still twitching on the floor." "Yes." "Another they cornered in the forum during an assembly. He ducked into a shop and changed clothes, but his retinue hung around out of pity and got him recognized and killed. Another, Annalus, was abandoned by his retinue and killed without a fight." I looked at Cneius. He leaned, his eyes to the ground and inscrutable, against a pillar, and listened. "Antonius's men caught up with Tyrannius, and he requested a stay of execution until his son—you know the effeminate wastrel, he runs in Antonius's circles— could make a plea on his behalf to Antonius. The soldiers laughed and said, Germanicus choked. You know what they said to him? He already has, but to the opposite effect. That's what this republic has come to, Marcus Tullius. Sons handing their fathers over to destruction. Everything is upside. My master raised a hand, and Germanicus stopped. My master sat now with his face in his hands. After a long time he muttered, I am fortunate I had the wisdom to send young Marcus out of the country. He raised his head and composed himself. Not out of any fear of him on my part, you understand, but fear for him. I will be no Tyrannius, I am sure, but neither do I want to lose another child. Fathers and sons are being slain together, as will no doubt not surprise you, Germanicus said. Nothing can surprise me any more, but enough. What did you say of Caesar? He takes no action to stop Antonius. You can count on no help from him. Are you sure? I am sure. They have an agreement. Antonius is the more powerful man. Caesar's lieutenant. What is a 20-year-old adopted son to do in the face of the deified Gaius Julius Caesar's most trusted man? Antonius has the upper hand. You should depart at once for Greece. Junius Brutus will much appreciate your presence in his army. It will lend him the legitimacy of the Senate. I have considered it, yes. My master had considered everything. He had at first made for Greece, as Germanicus was suggesting anew, and even turned back toward Rome at one point. The situation was unclear. We wandered in a fog from villa to villa. Gnaeus Mucius, he said at last. Gnaeus straightened. Yes, sir? You know Caesar, or know his reputation? I knew Julius Caesar, Senator, and have met the young Caesar. And what is your estimation of him? Like the Senator, he comes from humble origins. Comparison is unflattering in this situation, Centurion. You misunderstand me, Senator. I mean, Gnaeus was no Cicero. This could take some time. With respect, he has heart, but is a youth, and is untried. Marcus Antonius is tried. Thank you, Gnaeus Mucius. Yes, sir. My master raised his left hand to his chin and touched it, thinking. Germanicus waited. You know, Germanicus, my master said at length, I had half considered taking Cato's way out, but doing him one better. I would travel to Rome, to Antonius's house, and kill myself on his hearth. Germanicus's eyes widened. The action was rash. Suicide was just becoming fashionable then, but it would have brought a curse into Antonius's household. The goddess of the hearth would have forsaken him, and the spirits of his ancestors would have fled. Antonius's family would drift lifeless, with no guide or purpose. It would have been vengeance for my master, yes, but at an unthinkable price. Marcus, to think a few insults to Antonius and his wife, a few speeches against him in the Senate. Speeches. Someone has to speak. Brutus and his ilk, murderers all, but at least they did away with a king. They struck for liberty, but they forgot this one thing. You do not kill tyranny by killing a tyrant. Marcus Antonius took Caesar's place within a week. He is as much a threat as his old master was. I had thought we had a friend in this, but now the son, the boy Caesar, after so many overtures of peace and of the rule of law, after so many assurances to my face, has caved in. Handed us name by name on a list to that bull-necked pederast. No. Speaking was the least I could do. Just one more service to my country in a long career of service. We did not build this republic to succumb to a strong man. The people, Marcus, Germanicus said. Caesar was ever the favorite of the people. Damn the people, my master said. The best men, then, the aristocracy? Damn them both. There was a silence. Tiro shifted his weight. I found I was holding my breath. At last Gnaeus said, At least you're at the top of Antonius's list. That's some kind of flattery. My master immediately burst into laughter. He rose with no difficulty, walked to Gnaeus, and clapped him on the shoulder. Gnaeus grinned. My master turned back to Germanicus, beaming. Come, you should stay for lunch. We can talk more afterward. Perhaps go for a walk. Germanicus still looked uncomfortable. I am not much for walking these days, and if you do not mind my saying so, I am getting old too, yes. I have actually written a book on the subject. Have you read it? I looked at Tiro. We both grinned. Germanicus goggled at our master. He could barely keep up. Few could. Book? No, I believe not. Tiro, have a copy sent round to Germanicus. I dedicated the book to my dear friend Atticus. We are both growing so old. But perhaps you, Germanicus, would have been the better dedicatee. He led Germanicus away from the garden. The offer of lunch was not really optional. As he went, I caught Gnaeus's eye. The soldierly bluff he had shown in joking, blunting the edge of the moment, had gone. He seemed burdened, as I felt burdened. Tiro showed it too. When the two elders had gone, we followed. Ahead, my master ambled toward the dining room. His limp returned bit by bit as he walked, and as he showed Germanicus through the door, I saw him turn, his body blocking the view, and pull at the seizing finger of his right hand. Yeah, and that was the reading. That was the first two chapters, more or less, of my novella, The Last Day of Marcus Tullius Cicero, which is available on Amazon.com in both paperback and Kindle formats. It's gotten good reviews, and I have been gratified by the praise it's received, both from people who enjoy its political and cultural message about courage and virtue, as well as people who have enjoyed it for the historical elements, right? People who are enthusiasts for Rome seem to have still gotten a lot out of it. Um, Thanks again for listening. If you like what you hear, please look it up on Amazon and give it an order, give it a read, and write a review if you enjoyed it. And I'd really, really appreciate that. You can find out more about the book if you're not quite ready to buy, either at Amazon or Goodreads or on my personal website, jordanmposs.com, where you can find out about both The Last Day of Marcus Tullius Cicero and all of my other books. Thanks again for listening.